So why am I identifying what happens in competitive market so that we can differentiate it from monopsony market? So where the supply of labor is equals to the demand for labor, that's where the equilibrium in competitive labor market is. But that's not the case with monopsony. In monopsony, instead, what happens, that there is this thing known as marginal cost of labor, and marginal cost of labor will lie to the left of marginal cost of labor will lie to the left of supply of labor, right? Okay. Now, where the marginal cost of labor is equals to the demand for labor, where the marginal cost of labor is equals to the demand for labor, you put a dot there and then you bring it down. Students, have a look at this. You put a dot where the marginal cost of labor is equals to the demand for labor, and then you bring this dotted line down, just a second, right? And then you connect it to the, and then you connect it to the y-axis, and this is the quantity, and this is the quantity that the monopsony will hire. This is the quantity that monopsony will hire, and the wages that monopsony pay, it's not according to this level. So monopsony will not pay them, even though it should be paying them this wage, right? But they pay them according to the average cost, or monopsony market pay labor according to the supply of labor. So that is where this happens. So this is the wage that the monopsony will pay to its workers, right? So you can see for yourself that the wages in monopsony are lower than what are being paid in competitive market, and even the labor and even the quantity that monopsony market hires is less than what a perfectly competitive market hires. Is making sense? So wages are lower, and the quantity that's hired is also lower. This is making sense, students? So do you want me to explain it one more time, or is this making sense? Right, because think about it, that's a good question, Ruby. So the reason why they don't want to pay workers more, because they know that since they are the only firm in the market, right? And even if they pay them less, they don't have an option to switch. Are you getting me? If someone has invested so much, if someone has invested so much time and energy choosing a certain occupation and joining a certain field, now they can't really switch, right? And it's not that after all these years of studying nuclear engineering, you can do something different, or perhaps even you would want to do something different, right? So you're kind of stuck with that occupation. And as I was giving you this example, that in Pakistan, there's no other department, there's no other firm who wants to hire you, because they don't require your skill set, right? So they know that they have more bargaining power. Uh, right, exactly. That's the idea. That's the idea, right? So even though it's exploitation, but I mean, that's how, in economics, people gain benefit of each other, right? Because they know that they have more bargaining power, they are in a stronger position, so they can exploit the other party or the other group, and that's how they play along, right? So that's the idea. This is making sense, right? So students, let's look at this one more time. Let's look at this one more time so that you can remember it exactly, right? So the idea is fairly simple, that in monopsony, there's a single firm. So what happens in competitive market, the idea is that where the supply of labor is equal to the demand for labor, right? So where the supply of labor is equal to the demand for labor, that's where the equilibrium is, right? So upward sloping is the supply of labor, downward sloping is the demand for labor, where the two are equal. That will determine the equilibrium in competitive market, and that would be wage of competitive market and the quantity of labor that will be hired in the competitive market. Now, if you look at monopsony, now in the case of monopsony, right, there will be a marginal cost of labor, right? Now, what's marginal cost? Marginal cost is basically the additional cost that you need to hire each unit of labor. What's marginal cost of labor? Additional cost that you need to hire each unit of labor. Now, where the marginal cost of labor is equal to the demand for labor. Now, where the marginal cost of labor is equal to the demand for labor, right? That's where the equilibrium will be, right? So you bring this dotted line down and you connect it to the x-axis and you label it as QM. So this is the quantity of labor that will be hired in monopsony market, but they don't pay them according to the marginal wage, the marginal cost rate. Instead, in monopsony, they pay them according to the average, average cost or supply of labor, and that is a lower wage compared to what is being paid in competitive market. Right, so that's a lower wage compared to what's being paid in competitive market. So long story short, in monopsony, both the quantity hired of labor would be less, and the wages paid to workers would also be less compared to competitive market. So that's how labor is exploited in uh, what's that called, in monopsony market. Easy, students, are you getting me? Breathe, Mubin, is everything clear? Right, so that was the first thing. In the second case, explain, right? But before we jump on to the other case, you need to tell if that is justified or not, because that's what the question was asking for. If the labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rates still better left to that market? Now think about this, students. If someone is doing such an important work, if you think of especially a nuclear physicist, who is producing nuclear energy for your country, and you are paying them less just because they don't have an option of going and working someplace else, do you think that your country will be able to hire and retain this talent? So my simple question is that if Indians and Pakistanis go and study, nuclear physics outside their home countries, and when they come back, right, and they start working for this government department that's researching about nuclear energy, which could be very useful for the world, and things like that, right? But they're not being paid enough. So do you think that these people will prefer to come back, right? What do you think? You tell me first. Do you think that these people will prefer to come back and work in their own countries? The answer is no, right? They will eventually leave for better opportunities for other countries, to other countries. Yes, exactly, right? So to stop that from happening, right? What will the government do? Government will intervene and make sure that such workers are paid good enough for them to uh, continue uh, working in their own countries. Are you getting, right? So that's, I mean, subsidy is not really the word. So subsidy is not really the word. Subsidies are basically financial payments that you provide on products, right? So subsidies are financial payments that governments provide on production of goods or services, right? But what they will do, they will make some rules and policies around that, right? So I mean, giving you a simple example, and I hope that it helps in this case. So after some time, after a few years, right, what happens that the National Assembly of Pakistan, right, passes a bill saying that, government officials, or let's say especially the army officials, right, army people in Pakistan will get a 10% or 15% pay increase in addition to what they usually get, right, as per their own thing, right? So why are they doing that? They're just trying to motivate them. They're just trying to, increase their incentives and things like that, right? So that more smart people and more intelligent people choose this occupation of armed forces rather than going and working in some other sectors, right? So that's how they do it. So similarly, the government can pass a bill, the government can pass a legislation stating that, people working in, let's say, nuclear energy department of a country will be paid 50% more, let's say 60% more, and this much increase they will get every year and things like that. So that's how they do it. Is this making sense, students? So that's the idea here, right? Are we good? Can we move on? Right? Okay. Then the second case of imperfect labor market is where there are trade unions, right? So I'll quickly explain you what that happens. So trade union is a platform that represents workers in a certain firm or in a certain industry. So there are different type of trade unions. Sometimes a trade union is only related to that particular firm, right? So let's say all the people who are working in Toyota company, Toyota production plant. So there might be a trade union of Toyota production plant workers, right? So that would mean that all factory workers who work in that Toyota car producing factory will be part of that platform. Not even if not all, most of them might be part of it, right? And whenever they think that their rights are being infringed, right, their rights and they're not being provided enough rights and so on, then they can, go on strikes, they can go on protest and things like that to negotiate for their rights, right? Okay. That being said, so that's what trade union is, right? Now that being said, okay, students, now that being said, why is that a problem, and why how it creates an imperfect labor market? So presence of trade unions create an imperfect labor market. Why? Because they get more bargaining power against the firms, right? And obviously, when everyone is going on strike and protest, government can't, or sorry, the company can't help it, but they have to accept to their demands because they're losing so much business when people are not showing to workplace and they're not working and things like that, right? So that is how trade unions get to earn higher wages and things like that, right? So in this case, what the government can do, again, the government will make some rules and regulations around this, right? So the government can restrict powers of trade unions, government can stop them from going on protests and things like that, right? So simple example I can give you, I remember back a few days back, not few days, few years back, the doctors in Pakistan, right, in major cities, especially Islamabad, Karachi, and Lahore, they were on protest regarding few of their demands, right? So they were saying that, these demands should be addressed by the government or else we will be on strike. Now, just imagine if one day's doctors and nurses are away and they're not in hospitals, right? How much loss, like little loss of human lives could take place, right? And then obviously that put government in a difficult situation and the government had to accept their demands, right? So this is how this entire thing works. Are you getting me, students? Right? So again, that's problematic, but the government can make some rules and regulations to restrict power of trade unions. Then last of all, government intervention can also be problematic. So the most common case in which government intervenes in labor markets is to set minimum wages. And that is also true for a lot of countries. I mean, Pakistan is one country where we have minimum wages. I mean, it's also true for developed countries, right? So even a lot of developed countries have this minimum wage. So if the government thinks that certain type of labor is not earning enough, and that is important for them to earn a certain amount to ensure a basic living standard, like if you think of very low skill workers, right? Manual workers like construction workers and things like that, laborers as we say, right? So for them it's important that the government provides them some basic I mean, we're just wrapping it up, right? So in that case, what happens, right? So, or household help, right? In a lot of developing countries like Pakistan, India, some people are working as household help and therefore they might not be earning enough. They might not be earning enough, right? So what the government needs to do, government needs to provide them a basic living standard, right? Now, otherwise, if the government doesn't intervene, let's first have a look at what happens if the government doesn't intervene. So wages will be determined purely by the market forces, as we know. If the government doesn't interfere, the equilibrium in the market is based on supply and demand for labor, where the supply and demand are equal, right? That will be the equilibrium point that shows how much workers will earn. Let's say this is the market rate. So let's say each worker is earning, let's say 15,000 rupees, right, per month, right? And the government think that this is too less for someone to sustain a family or to, support themselves even. 15,000 rupees per month, right? 15K, right? And how much quantity of labor is hired? We can imagine 2 million laborers are employed in this country, right? Okay, now this being said, if the government thinks that this prevailing wage rate is too less, 15,000 rupees per month, then the government can set a minimum wage. Now, what is that minimum wage? Minimum wage is set above the equilibrium. Yes or no? So minimum wage is set above the equilibrium. And why is government doing that? We have already discussed, to ensure that these people are getting at least enough income to pay for their basic necessities and sustain a basic living standard, right? Now, if you see what happens at the minimum wage, so let's say the government has set the minimum wage to be, 25,000 rupees instead of 15, which government considered to be too low, less, government has set it to be 25,000 rupees. Price floor, exactly. Right. Yes, exactly. Minimum prices as we discussed, right, in AS. Now, the problem with the minimum wage is always, do remember that the minimum wage will create a surplus in the market, surplus of labor. How do we know this? Because if you see for yourself that this wage rate intersects the supply at this point and it intersects the demand curve at this point. So let's assume that there are 3 million people who are willing to work. So supply is showing you number of people who are available for work. So there are 3 million people who are willing to work, and there's only, let's say, 0.5 million people who are being demanded at this wage rate. Why? Because obviously when wage rate is high, less companies, fewer companies would want to hire people, right? So the difference between 3 and 0.5 is 2.5. So there's 2.5 million excess of labor. Now these are all the people who will get unemployed. These are all the people who will get unemployed. So again, this is a disaster for the labor market. Why? Because there are so many people who are out of work and the government needs to provide them work, right? So that's another case of imperfect labor market. Okay, now we'll do, so this is how you were supposed to answer this question. And then in every case, you were supposed to suggest that how should government deal with this situation, right? So long story short, in B part, the question was saying if labor market is imperfect, is the determination of wage rate still better left to that market? So first of all, you have to explain what imperfect labor market is. Then you need to say that how wages are determined in imperfect in each of these cases of imperfect labor market, where we discussed monopsony, presence of trade union, and government intervention. And then for each case, you need to comment that how can government help to resolve that issue, right? So that was about it, right? So let's stop it for today, right? And then I was just thinking if I can, okay, now students, if you can do this question as a homework, right? So this is a fairly simple question. So I'm giving you, and for tomorrow's class, if you can attempt this question. So let me share this on the WhatsApp group, right? Try to do this. So let's read it out together, right? And then I'll just give you some roadmap as to how you need to answer this. So the question says, in 2002, in the UK public sector, firefighters threatened to go on strike because they stated that their earnings were very low compared to other workers. In the same year, Robbie Williams, a singer from the UK, signed the largest ever recording deal with the music industry worth millions of pounds. Discuss whether economic theory of wages can explain how workers in a vital industry such as firefighting service can have lower pay than workers in a less vital industry such as entertainment. So what you need to do in this question, simply the question says that why some people earn more and why some occupations or why some people earn less, right? So you have to explain what's the economic theory behind it, the demand for labor, supply of labor. You would remember we talked in detail that some occupations have more demand. Why? Because their marginal revenue product of labor is more, right? So what is demand for labor? What is marginal revenue product of labor? You will explain all those things. Then you'll explain why Robbie Williams, a singer, has marginal revenue, higher marginal revenue, and why firefighters have lower marginal revenue. And then similarly, you need to explain that why supply of firefighters might be more, because you don't need that much education for it. I mean, you do need courage, you do need a lot of other skills, right? It's not an easy task, but I mean, the supply of firefighters will still be more because, that doesn't require a lot of years of training or a lot of years of education. But on the other hand, for singers like Robbie Williams, I don't even know who he is, but the idea is that you need to have a certain special type of skill and talent to be a singer, right? And therefore the supply of people like this will be less, and therefore less supply and more demand for singers mean higher wages, and less demand and more supply of firefighters mean lower wages. So that's all what you need to explain in this question. Is everyone clear on this, right? So students, try to attempt this question, and tomorrow we'll continue from here and we'll do a few more questions about labor market, right? I'll communicate the time for tomorrow's class, but it will be approximately around this time, right? Okay, so I'll see you then. Have a good afternoon, right? And take care. Bye.